FM Freedom Show, The Wake Up Call on WCOM-LP, Chapel Hill and Carrboro 103.5 on your FM dial, or live streaming at WCOMFM.org. You can also watch the show on the People's Channel after a week's delay on Thursday night at 10 p.m., Friday morning at 6 a.m., or Tuesday at noon. The show will also be available on our YouTube channel, Wilf Wake Up Call. I'm Mary Schwinzer here with our host, Lori Hoyt, and Emily O'Hare on the camera. Today our special guest is Herman Greene.
Thank you. This is, we're here again on a Wednesday afternoon, and it's a particularly beautiful one. And we're delighted to have Herman Greene as our guest. I've known Herman for quite a few years, and due to our mutual interest in Thomas Berry. So, Herman, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll talk some about Thomas Berry, who is our main topic today.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I was born in North Carolina in 1945, and my father taught at the University at North Carolina State in agriculture economics, and later at the University of Florida. I went to school in Florida for the university, and then to Stanford and got a graduate degree there in political science. Then I studied at the University of Chicago Divinity School and got a degree there, and worked in an inner city ministry for about 8 years. And at that time I went into law. I went to the University of North Carolina Law School, and from there to Wall Street for 12 years. And for a year I served as the Director of Public Responsibility of American Express Company. And I returned to North Carolina in 1992, and I've worked with technology companies as a lawyer until this last December. But alongside that, while I was in New York, I was in a small Methodist church, and I met Thomas Berry. He came there to preach. He had a center in Riverdale, New York, called the Riverdale Center for Religious Research. And he distributed papers that he had written. At that time, he was not famous, so we got mimeographed papers, purple papers that were passed around among people. And it changed my life, no question about it. And particularly since I moved back in '92, I've been devoted to his work. And I had an opportunity, because he's from Greensboro. He moved back here at 80 years old to Greensboro, and lived 14 more years, and during that time I visited him once a month. And I also started a center that's focused on his work called the Center for Ecozoic Studies. We'll talk more about ecozoic later. And now that's 20 years old, and we're still going strong. So.
And that's where I met you at some of the conferences that the Center for Ecozoic Studies, and I think Thomas's brother Jim helped organize those conferences. I think were they once a year or once every couple of years at Camp New Hope?
Yes, well, his brother, he was retired military, but he really changed after he left the military. He actually was a peace activist first, and then he got tied into his brother's ideas and became an ecologist. And he had a center with an unusual name of the Center for Reflection on the Second Law.
Oh, that's right.
And he had conferences at Camp New Hope north of Chapel Hill for about 20 years. So they were actually his conferences, and my organization grew out of the work there.
Yes.
I'm sorry today I have laryngitis.
That you sound fine. Well, those conferences meant so much to me, and I piggybacked into my finding out about Thomas Berry from my sister Joyce Hummel, who was a Dominican Catholic sister from Long Island, and she just passed this January, sadly, at age 80. But she had taught for 30 years, but she has always, her whole life, been interested in science and religion were her two passions. And she's also worked with a very dynamic sister, Sister Jean Clark. I don't know if you've heard of her.
I have heard of her, yes.
Yeah, they developed a curriculum based on Thomas's work for some Catholic elementary schools in Brooklyn, I believe, or in the city somewhere.
Mhm.
And so she is the one first started talking to me about how thrilled she was with this book by Thomas Berry called Dream of the Earth. And it was the book of the year with the Sierra Club in, I think, 98 or 99.
Well, it was actually published in '88.
Maybe
Yeah.
but anyhow, yeah, I think and that book just opened my heart up, and especially
It sold over 100,000 copies.
especially his appreciation for the indigenous peoples around the world, and their connection with their spirituality, with all of nature, with the earth, and that just was so moving to me. And also with pagans, with the Starhawk, the pagan priestess, and this was like a new world opening to me. So anyhow, we all keep talking about my sister,
Well, no, it's
although I could have a whole program about my
It's
sister.
a good segue into Thomas.
That was my way.
Yeah.
That was my way.
So Thomas was born in 1914, and his father was a clerk at a railroad in Greensboro. And they began picking up coal that fell off coal cars and selling coal on the side. And then his father formed a transportation company for delivering coal. And it continues today. Berryco, it's a large oil and gas transportation company,
Oh my goodness.
which is highly ironic considering Thomas's own concerns. Thomas had half of his family, which was a big family. He had 13 children in his family. Went into the monastery, and half went into business. So they had that kind of division. Thomas was a very reflective person as growing up. He said he always sensed that something wasn't right. I mean, he was at that point where, you know, cars were coming and the city was expanding and industry was coming in. He just had this feeling something wasn't right, and he was a contemplative person. He always tells the joke that he could only think of two places where he could live a contemplative life. One was in jail and one was in a monastery. So he decided to go into a monastery. So he went to St. Mary's Preparatory School in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and was in high school, and then decided later to join the Passionist order and become a priest. And he went to a theological school in Dunkirk, New York, and later got a PhD at Catholic University. And he became essentially a historian of cultures. His order was, different Catholic orders played different roles, and his order was focused on preaching and serving as priest at churches. Thomas was unusual because he wanted to be in that order, but he was one that wanted to go into teaching. And while many of the priests in the order taught at the seminary, there was no one in his order who'd ever taught at a university. So he got permission to teach at a university. And he'd been drawn to the order in part because he wanted to do a mission work in China. So in 1948, he was able to go to China. He was a terribly inquisitive person. He just really wanted to have a picture of all the cultures of the world. He read all of Aquinas in Latin. That's like 27 volumes, as large as your hands. He read all of Augustine in Latin. He learned Chinese and studied the Chinese classics. He learned Sanskrit and studied the Indian classics. He wrote books about Buddhism and Eastern religions. And as he continued in his teaching and his work, he he stayed as a historian of culture, but he became more and more aware of the ecological crisis. In part, this was connected with his study of Teilhard de Chardin's work. Teilhard de Chardin was a paleontologist, a Jesuit, who did his work in China, and he was known for being one of the paleontologists who studied the Beijing man, which at the time was thought to be maybe the oldest human remains. So he was quite well known as a paleontologist, but he was quite intrigued by the relationships he was finding in the fossil record.
That is Teilhard.
Teilhard,
Yeah,
yeah.
Teilhard.
And so he wrote a book called The Phenomenon of the Human. And he said if there's this continuous pattern of development from one species to another, and it leads to the human, that the human capacities must be present in the universe from the beginning. And this really took Thomas, and in the 70s, he was teaching at Fordham University, and he formed the Riverdale Center for Religious Research. And at this age, which was kind of advanced for, in a sense, beginning a new career, he was in his 70s, 74 would be 60, excuse me. But he began talking, and he was always kind of out in front of people. And he became more and more interested in the ecological situation and what he called the new story. He saw that humans have to have a strong cultural grounding. And as he studied the religions and cultures of the world, he realized that for most of human experience, there's been a strong connection with the universe, with a cosmic sense. In fact, he talks about religion as a reaction to the fear that people experienced early on of the cosmic powers and the wildness of nature and so forth. They had to have some way of coping with that, and also discovering that the grandeur. I'll try to shorten it.
No, we have plenty of time. We're doing great.
So he decided that cosmology was really the basis of cultures. And he had this sense that the cosmology of the modern period, and even of the Christian tradition of which he was a part, was from a past understanding of the universe, and that the new scientific story of the universe was a very powerful story. And he would say that the universe is ever integral with itself. So if it's ever integral with itself, and we have these capacities for consciousness and psychic awareness, then this must be evidenced in everything throughout the universe. So the new story became one of his primary works, and we'll come back to that. But also his very extensive critique of modern culture and the Enlightenment mentality and mechanistic understandings, and a critique of the church, and then a vision he would speak of Ecozoic era. He became convinced, not by his own reckoning, but because of what science is teaching us, that we are in the 6th mass extinction, and that we're going through something that humans have never gone through before, which is the termination of a geological period in Earth's history. This has only happened 5 times before.
And I have to say that the first time I heard about we're in this 6th extinction was years ago, in the
Yes.
early 80s and 90s, from Thomas Berry.
Right.
And now that, now you hear it from other people, of course, but this was the first time I heard anything about that. He's been such a visionary. I just had a...
He's an incredible visionary. So he says, the current geological period is called the Cenozoic, and it began after the termination of the dinosaurs and the killing off of I think 80% of the species at that time, which led to the age of mammals. The mammals have really flourished in this later period. But now we're in the terminal Cenozoic period. Scientists are recognizing that. They're calling it the Anthropocene epoch. So the Ecozoic is a vision of how humans will be involved in all aspects of life, but with a new consciousness. So it's this vision and his understandings for reform that have been so important to me and to others.
Yeah. So there was, there were those conferences, and then I know, and I met Thomas at a few of them, but then Thomas, when did he pass away?
In June 1, 2009. So in just a couple of weeks, it'll be exactly 10 years. June 1, 2019 will be the 10th anniversary of his death.
And I know that somebody asked me, well, what I mentioned Thomas Berry, and they said, well, what was he for? And I'm not very good at explaining, but I do know that out of his work, and I think you mentioned before our show, the different organizations that are carrying on his work and thinking. Maybe you could talk about some of them. I know you're involved in at least one, if not more.
Yeah.
And also, you mentioned about California being a center there, and also that there is some international work being done. So maybe we could kind of get a broader grasp, because I'm sure there's some people who have heard of Thomas Berry, especially around here, but I'm sure there's some people who have not.
Yes, well, when a person dies, I had the opportunity of being close to several people that in their late years. It was a blessing to me. I won't go through each of their names because one of them was a philosopher, and he was very concerned that his work would go on. He felt it had enduring value, and he's one of my three great teachers, so it certainly endured in me. But actually his work has not been continued. He's still recognized, but not many people are working on his work. That is not the case with Thomas Berry at all. So there was a burst of activity around Thomas in the 90s and the 2000s. There were many religiously oriented groups that took to his work. There's a group called Sisters of Earth, which is about 300 Catholic nuns. As you know, the Catholic nuns have had kind of a rough go in the Catholic Church.
Yes.
They haven't had a chance to take on new positions, and some of their old positions have been taken away. Their numbers have been reduced, and the orders are aging. So one of the most important new influences among Catholic religious women is the work of Thomas Berry, and his new sense of a religion that's cosmically oriented, but also oriented toward care for the earth. So that's been very important. There's many things. The church was fairly late to the environmental issue. I won't go through the entire history, but a lot of us know that who was the one that had the book on Rachel?
Oh, Rachel Carson.
Carson, yeah, Rachel Carson. She kind of started the modern environmental movement with her book on Silent Spring. But there wasn't any theologians or people in the church working on that subject at that time. There were antecedents in the environmental field. In fact, to my understanding, the first book was John Cobb's book in 1972 called Is It Too Late, surprisingly.
Wow.
And since then, a lot of work has gone in this field. But Thomas has been probably as influential as anyone. I would say the most influential person in religion and ecology. There was a series of 10 conferences at the Harvard Center for World Religions on the religions of the world and ecology, Shintoism and ecology, Confucianism and ecology, and so forth. Over 800 scholars presented. A very important center is now at Yale University called the Forum on Religion and Ecology. Teaching positions have been opened up in religion and ecology. And some of this would have come anyway, but Thomas is a very important influence both in religion and ecology and environmental concern for the church, but another thing that's slightly different, which is ecological spirituality.
Yeah.
So ecological spirituality is the sense that most of us have some of our deepest experiences of religious feeling in a natural setting. And I guess that's enough on that because we have a lot to cover, but Thomas awakened many poets, many songwriters, many liturgists to bring the ecological spirituality into the life of the church. So that's a major influence. Another major influence has been his work with law, which is kind of unusual. This is a Catholic priest, had no legal training, but he became convinced that the way he would put it, the primary flaw in human development is the radical discontinuity between humans and the natural world, and that we've given all the rights to the human beings. So he wanted to write about the rights of nature. And this was his last work. He didn't start on this until this century, when he was 85 years old. I saw early drafts of his 10 principles. But surprisingly, his 10 principles of Earth jurisprudence have given rise to groups all around the world working on Earth law. So, for example, now in the Ecuadorian Constitution and the Bolivian Constitution, nature is now given rights within the Constitution. So we have human rights in our Constitution, but not rights for the natural world. In Ecuador and Bolivia, they do. And there's been rivers, like the Ganges River has been declared a person. I mean, if corporations can be persons, why can't rivers?
Absolutely.
So it's quite amazing, and I in particular, I was a lawyer for 40 years, and I have worked in this field of Earth jurisprudence, and I'm currently one of 4 editors of a new textbook on Earth law, emerging ecocentric law, we call it. And it's going to be published by the largest law publishers, and they're going to put a major effort into marketing it so that this is taught in many law schools. And the difference between earth law and environmental law is dealing with the negative side effects of industrial development, trying to remediate or reduce them, but not really challenging the structure itself. So earth law is concerned, what kind of laws do we need to have in place so that humans live within nature's boundaries, and how do we prospectively preserve ecosystems and other species? So it's a very, very important field, and a lot of work is being done in it. It's
So
clearly,
like the rights of rivers, the rights of
the rights of
laws.
rivers, and
That-
so forth. They would be, if you can argue for, my right to do this and your right to do this, then if you're doing something that's affecting a river, then someone else should also represent the rights of the fish to be in the river. Now, nobody's rights gets preserved all the time. I mean, it's a contest, but working out those concepts that would allow people to take that into account, because, and this goes back to Barry's work as well, but also to science's work, is we're all interdependent. We're all interreferent. Everything that we do that affects one thing affects the whole. And if we don't understand that, we're in trouble, which we are. We are in trouble. Barry was a critic of industrial civilization. And that's kind of a long topic, but let me just make it short this way in saying that we currently live in a society that's dominated by the values of economics and industry, which means that we make our most important decisions on a cost-benefit analysis. And when we think about what's needed to make the future better, we think about how do we expand industrial production, increase the productivity so that there's a higher standard of living and more well-being. But in doing so, we're slowly killing ourselves. His vision was of an ecological cultural society, where the primary concerns would be how to maintain the health of the earth. Like when you're a mother, your primary concern is the health of your child, right? So what if we look, I mean, we don't have an economy without the earth being healthy. So what if we made that our first concern? Now, how that works and the educational programs and the values, that's what we're kind of going through. It's not that we'll get there someday. It's already taking place. Many people are working on this. So sometimes I like to say that there's a deep current underneath what we see at the top. You know, we see all this activity in the world and expansion. But there are many people in sustainable development, deep ecology, Thomas Berry people all around the world that are working on how to bring into being this kind of society. The other part is cultural, is what's most important is how we develop our own character as human beings and the roles we play in society. So the questions would be, how do we promote full human development and the flourishing of life on Earth?
Herman, we're going to take a station break. We can catch our breath,
Okay.
look over notes, make sure we don't leave out some really important things like the new book, biography that's just come out, and we're going to give our station a
This is Wolf's Wake Up Call on WCOMLP, Chapel Hill and Carver, 103.5 FM. You can stream us live at WCOMFM.org.
Thank you, Iris. We're talking to Herman Greene, who's worn many hats with industry, technology, law, but at a significant time in his life, he was exposed to Thomas Berry when he was in New York, and Thomas Berry was teaching in New York at that time, and changed his life. When I heard about Thomas Berry, it changed a lot of my own thinking and understanding, which is, of course, for all of us, it's still an evolving thing. And Herman is with us today. It's 10 years since Thomas Berry died, and there's still many organizations. We're talking about the many ways his work has influenced so many people, not just Herman and I and a few many others, but there's all kinds of, I was really interested, this will impress, it is impressive, the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, the Harvard conference that you talked about, and also that there is international understanding, because Thomas Berry's thinking is what is desperately needed in our fragmented, toxic, painful times and alienated times and depressed times, and his message is one that's basically of hope. He's showing a path for us to reorient our value system that I think will appeal to most people once they grasp it. So we'll continue on where you were at, Herman, about our conversation.
Well, I think that's the right thing, is to turn to what's happening at this time on the 10th anniversary of his death. So again, I raised the point earlier, is that sometimes when a person is alive, there's a community that develops around the person. It's related to the person. He might have taught or done other things. But then after that person dies, the work either reduces, or with some few people it continues. Now, Thomas had a remarkable group of connections. I had, in 2009, the year that he died, I collected 152 tributes to Thomas. And I would guess that there's at least 1,000 people who felt they had more than that probably, that thought they had a very deep personal connection. There's kind of a little irony here, because I don't know how many people I've talked to that really thought they had the closest connection. It was kind of like Jesus, like, who are you closest to, right? But he had the ability to reach out to you just where you were. So if you were interested in gardens, he would be that. The people who were indigenous, he could relate to him. The people who were professors who would relate to him. The lawyers would relate to him. The people who were religious would relate to him. And I found in talking with people that the conversations they would have would all be different.
Yeah.
He was a polymath. He was the best historian I've ever met. He could just relate to anybody. Well, at any rate, so...
and he also had a great sense of humor.
Oh, well, he had a great sense of humor.
He was very humble and unprepossessing. He's kind of a short guy. He had a twinkle in his eye. You know, you just felt, because I met him in his older age, I could go up and hug him, you know.
Yeah.
He just had that warmth that he radiated, that, and it just made you so comfortable right away. And I didn't get nervous in situations, and right away, even though I knew a lot about him, and I was ready to be intimidated, well, he doesn't let that happen.
No, he was as unpretentious as you can,
yes,
as you can get.
Yeah.
So at any rate, so what I feel is happening now is a real resurgence of the work around Thomas Berry. And I'm going to point to a couple of things. I guess the first thing to point to is that the situation is so evidently much worse than it was before. I don't want to get into too much of the negative, but some of you may have seen the article this week that it was 84 degrees in the Arctic Circle, and that the concentration of CO2 has risen to 415. Half the carbon emissions that have ever been produced have been produced in the last 50 years, 30% in the last 10 years. It continues to increase. The jump this year from 412 to 415 is, I mean, that's higher than it's been. So we have all these international agreements and efforts and consciousness, but it's not changing the way that we're going.
And the UN is finally, just in the last, 6 months, has come out with 2 major reports, the last one just a few weeks ago, that are terrifying.
Yeah.
They're terrifying. But, you know, we can sit around and get terrified, or drink ourselves to death, or we can try to get involved in a path to try to make things better for us, and our children and grandchildren.
Right. So yes, indeed. The question is, can it be done just out of the value system of modernity, which is basically to place the hope in technology?
Yeah.
I read this week that there was some entrepreneurs working on fusion And if we were able to harness fusion, I suppose we would not have an energy problem. But fusion is always 20 years away. I guess the trajectory, when people, environmentalists talk about the factors, they talk about three things. One is in population. That's one that's easy for people to understand. But that might not even be the biggest one. I could give you some figures on that. The second is wealth. And the third is technology. So the bigger the population, the more wealth, the more technology, the worse things get. And nothing has changed.
That's a good one. That's
You might have lower emissions per unit of GDP, but if the GDP keeps growing, then even though it's more efficient, it's still getting worse, and that's what's basically happening. So Thomas would say that no, we have to really look at and move into an ecological age, move from an industrial. Now, it doesn't mean we wouldn't have industry, but I'm not trying to defend industry, nor am I trying to condemn it for that matter. But we will have to make changes that are uncomfortable, or else we'll have to continue with a kind of faith in technology. Now, how long do we go on with that faith? When do we say no? When do we say it's not working, it hasn't worked, it's only gotten worse? When do we be willing to really step forward and say that we have to head in another direction and fundamentally change and incur the huge cost that it would take to make a transition to rebuild our communities? But also it concerns our institutions. We teach people the way we worship, the things we value, our laws, and on and on. Thomas, to me, is the prophet of the future, and that's the reason that of the ecological future. Now, I could never prove that, and I feel a little funny in saying it because his community is not that large when you take it and compare it on a global scale. It's not billions of people. But I think important ideas start with a small group and grow. Now, this bio that has just been published by Yale University Press, the authors are Mary Evelyn Tucker, who teaches at the School of the Environment and the Theology School at Yale University, and she's always been the primary editor of Thomas's work ever since the beginning. Is one of the authors of this. John Grimm, who is her husband, who is has been her partner in all of the work. He also teaches in the theology school and in the School of the Environment. And Andrew Angel of Elon University, retired professor who taught environmental studies there and wrote several biographies on ecological figures. But it's a major accomplishment. It's being published by Columbia University. They know its importance. It's just now being released. Its official release date is June 4th.
Oh, June 4th.
But
and her name was Mary
Evelyn Tucker.
Mary Evelyn.
And it has a very simple name, Thomas Berry, a biography, as unassuming as he was. But it really, again, I go back to the Bible, where it says, who do people say that I am? Well, this book is like, this is the man. It's like, you read that bio, and you understand, you grasp the incredible a character that he had, and incredible knowledge. And you begin to see how wide his influence were, how many seeds he planted in many different areas. He, let's see, I've got the wrong one here. I've got the outline of that here. They talk about his work with, well, it's not very well described here, but he worked a lot with indigenous communities, not just in the United States, but in South America, and Africa, Canada. He worked with the indigenous community in the Philippines. He worked with people in the Far East. He worked with people throughout North America and Europe, and in so many different disciplines that he worked in. Anyway, so I think that that this is a very significant accomplishment because he comes alive. There's an interesting thing about the picture. I'm sorry, I didn't know it would be live streamed today, or I would have brought the book. But it's photoshopped, and he's in black and white, kind of a silvery aspect on the cover. The rest of the cover is green and black. At the Riverdale Center for Religious Research, there was a great oak tree that was famous in the Barrie community. It took, I think, 13 people holding hands to get around it. So that great oak tree is in the background. But he's kind of standing out in silver in the front. And that's what I mean, that he comes alive as a person, as kind of a historical figure. Gosh, I'm surprised at what's coming to my mind. It's kind of a coming back. It's kind of a coming back of his persona with its power into history. And so that might be a segue into the conference we're having here, which is called The Living Legacy of Thomas Barrie, which is remembering his life and renewing his work. So many of us, like Laurie and I, we're not spring chickens anymore. We've been involved in this work for 30 years, and we're coming together. We've made this an invitation-only event. We have people from throughout Canada and North America, but the United States, who will be coming. It's not a large conference, it's 80 people, but it's kind of gathering people who've been involved in this work for a long time to reconnect with, again, the I don't know, the spirit of Thomas, I guess you'd say. It's something, it's not exactly an intellectual thing, and it's not really just a connection with Thomas, it's a kind of connection with the universe. So we will begin at a place called Timberlake Earth Sanctuary, which is a farm that has been dedicated to having events where people reconnect with nature. And the first day, on May 30th, we'll have a day of reflection at Timberlake Earth Sanctuary. That's run by Carolyn Tobin. Yeah. And another woman who is called Peggy Whalen Levitt, who has a Center for Education Imagination in the Natural World. And they hold programs at Timberlake Earth Sanctuary. They hold 80 programs a year for school children.
Oh, that's
wonderful. Programs working with...
That'll speak to Emily's heart as a teacher.
But we were just talking about this today.
Tell him.
Yeah.
Tell him what you were saying.
Well, I was thinking that we're kind of remiss in teaching our children about the environment and the world and their role in, making things better. So we're just protecting it and being the stewards of the earth and taking on that role. Just talking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because that's where it has to start, and they're learning some things about recycling. They are learning more than we learned, but Emily was just bemoaning that the schools need to go so much deeper.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, well, many people have heard of Richard Lou's book, The Last Child in the Woods.
no.
And his work was inspired by Thomas Berry.
What's his
Oh.
name, Richard who?
Richard Louv, L-U-V. And his book was published by Algonquin Books here in Chapel Hill, and it has been a bestseller. But
Did
children
you say
need
the title again?
The Last Child in the Woods.
Oh, boy.
And it's how young people are losing their connection with the natural world and what it means for a person, what it's meant for us, the connections that we've had, and how to reestablish that. So it's that connection that they're reestablishing. And the next 2 days will be at Pickard's Mountain the Echo Institute at Pickard's Mountain, which is about maybe 5 miles, maybe 10 miles from where we are right now.
About 7.
7 miles. It's just west of Carrboro, North Carolina. And it's a center that focuses on reskilling, reconnecting people with the earth. And it has an Odyssey Fellows program where it brings people in who are 18 to 28 years old. And they work on a farm, and they study a book called Ecological Spirituality, and they have these a number of programs. I'm not able to adequately describe it, but their lives are really changed in that. They have a regular schedule of events, and they have a very, very nice facility that has been built. They're very imaginative. And in those days, we'll reflect on the work that we've done on Friday and on Saturday. Mary Evelyn Tucker, John Graham, and Andrew Angel will be there to present the biography. And then in the afternoon, where do we go from here? How do we take this forward? Before we end, but let me go to you, Laurie. Do you want to ask a question at this point?
Well,
I have
no,
one
I
more thing I wanted
think
to cover.
since a lot of people, I guess, from this conference, I guess it's like to reinvigorate us and re-inspire us about Thomas Berry, and hopefully that will take that message back to our churches, our organizations, and friends that we know. And I think they want to have some papers come out of this conference too.
Well, I'm glad you raised that, because in 2014, on the 5th anniversary of Thomas's death, my center, the Center for Ecozoic Studies, had a colloquium, an academic colloquium. And we published a book about as thick as this one. That was 27 academic papers on Thomas. But this program is really focusing on the practice. Every person that has grown has been touched deeply by some educator, or by some Sunday school teacher, or by some minister, or some parent or grandparent, some mentor. So it's this unseen work of teaching, of practicing it in our daily lives that we're trying to influence here. So again, I don't think it's completely analogous to talk about the early church.
Maybe you could show us that book and tell us a
I
little.
will, but it's a little bit like the early church, that how it began to grow as a small community and then expand through its teaching.
Yeah.
So the last thing I'll mention,
Your
and
work
then
with
we
the
have some follow-up things,
Ecozoic studies,
is we're a center that is, we call it a Thought, Imagination, and Dialogue Center for Ecological Civilization. We have a bi-monthly Ecozoic review that's free, it's online.
Oh.
Our website is called ecozoicstudies.org, and you can sign up there for free. And then we have a print journal that we do annually. This one is called The Ecozoic Way. So when I talked about how you would live in a fundamentally different way, this is a collection of the ideas that we've developed over the last 20 years, all of which are related to the Thomas Berry's work. But they provide a set of understandings out of which
So since
a
it's
new
several
society
papers,
could
it's
be.
not a particular author, or is it,
Well,
is it the
we
organization who's
have,
put
we
it out?
have foundational statements like, what does Ecozoic mean? What's the great work mean? Why was Thomas Berry important? What are the determining features of the Ecozoic era? Then we have foundational essays, some of which are by Thomas, like his essay on the Ecozoic era.
Mm-hmm.
In Brian Swilm's and Thomas Berry's vision of the Ecozoic, Reinventing the Human, a call for ecozoic societies. Then we have key essays.
But on the cover, if one went to, I know the book was just in the press right now, but on the cover, if you got, asked for the book, The Ecozoic, does it just say,
Okay, so the name of our journal is the Ecozoic.
yes?
Oh,
So that's
not
the name of our journal. This is the
Okay.
5th issue of our journal.
Oh, so this is from the journal,
And the subtitle for this issue
okay.
is The Ecozoic Way,
Ah,
the
okay.
foundational papers of the Center for Ecozoic
Okay,
Studies.
got it.
So we have foundational statements, foundational essays, key essays, like one's on the Anthropocene, which is not a Thomas Berry concept, but it kind of places his a relationship to other things that are going on. We have key documents that are being used by other groups that are working for sustainability, like the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Then we have foundational books, and we have detailed reviews of the 6 key books of Thomas, which were The Dream of the Earth,
That's what I'm,
The Universe Story, The Great Work,
oh, the great, okay. So-
Evening Thoughts, The Christian Future and the Fate of the Earth, and The Sacred Universe. So we have detailed reviews of those. And then we have other key books that we feel are foundational to an ecological age. So we've got reviews of 20 more books. So that's what we put together in this.
Okay, we've got just a couple more minutes. Where did the time go?
Yeah.
But we've got this. It's been good. We've been talking about Thomas. We can have you on again. We can talk about Thomas again because he was a man for these times, and we need his thinking, his grasp of history with the different ages and what the age we're in and what's been going wrong with it and what are some things we can think about to try to do to stop it from its headlong rush into destroying us all, into rebuilding our sense of community, our values, and you know, I remember some years ago there was a book came out about there's some limits to and
Limits
there
to
was,
Growth. Yeah.
who was it?
Limits to Growth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And boy, people had a fit. Oh no, you know, and you hear about this with, you know, I don't want any limits. I want to do what I want to do. I don't care who it affects. It's all this sense of, which Thomas talks about, that sense of alienation. That
Yeah.
when he was talking about this age of barbarism, where it's every man for himself, and you know, and devil take the hindmost, you could say. And, you know, he just outlined it all, where we've been before with some of that kind of thinking, and the way things changed, and how more than ever we need to do a change in course, you know. And I just think he's going to be such an important figure, and the more we can let people know about him. And this is wonderful, his biography, because that gives you something for people to hang on to, that they can look at depth about it, because it's complicated thinking. You can't just put it out in a couple of sentences, or maybe you can.
Well, it is deep thinking, and
It's deep thinking, yes,
yeah.
it's deep thinking,
Yeah.
deep ecology, deep
Yeah.
understanding.
Thomas, I don't know if he coined the phrase. It's a simple phrase, but he talked about Earth community. So we're in a time where we have to move beyond individualism
Yeah.
And even on at national scales, we need to move not to America first, but to Earth first.
Earth first.
Earth first.
I like that.
And
Yeah.
instead of being, thinking nationalistically, we're worldlings.
Yeah,
We're part of this world. We can't just say we're separate from everything else.
no, we can't.
No, we're not separate from
Yeah.
nature. We're not separate from the rest of this
And-
world.
These choices are being forced upon us.
Yes.
Someone said that climate change is not susceptible to ideological viewpoint, your political viewpoint. I mean, you can be against it, or say it's not happening or whatever, but that doesn't change anything.
Doesn't change it.
I mean,
Herman, our
it either
time
is or
is
it's not.
up. You're
Yes.
gonna have to come back and not wait another 2, 3, 4 years,
Yeah.
okay? And
After your conference, that would be great to hear
yeah,
what went
have
on.
a
Okay,
Yeah.
I'd be happy to.
Thank you so much, Herman Greene, Thomas Berry's dear friend,